The tape recordings you are about to hear were recorded in undisclosed locations more than 20 years ago. They were made on an old microcassette recorder and have never been played publicly before. Some of the things that are said may be both difficult to understand due to the quality of the tapes and troubling to hear due to content. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you very much. This is another one of ours. It's one called Leave It All Behind. Let's give it up. We'd like to welcome the summer to Chicago.
We want to take you back to Chicago in the 1990s. For Abden and me, this is a soundtrack to our 20s. This is an Irish folk rock band called the Drovers, whose run of fame included roles in the movies Backdraft, Blink, and Road to Perdition.
I was such a Drovers groupie, I married their sister. You see, in the 1990s, there was something of an Irish cultural renaissance afoot in Chicago, with ceilidh dances and Irish language courses being offered at the Irish American Heritage Center and Gaelic football matches at Gaelic Park.
Maybe we're a storybook that has no pages left. Maybe we can lay out common ground. Maybe it's the passion.
It was 1994 when Chicago native Michael Flatley launched his first performance of Riverdance during the Eurovision Song Contest in Dublin.
Irish dancers, the Celtic Choir Onuana, and the magical dance partnership of Jean Butler and Michael Flatley.
Ladies and gentlemen, Riverdance.
World-renowned Irish musicians were coming out of Chicago, like Liz Carroll and Martin Hayes. The establishment was controlled by Irish Americans like Mayor Richard Daley.
It seemed like every significant local political office was filled by someone with an Irish last name, from the county medical examiner, Donahue, to the chief judge, O'Connell, to a governor, Ryan, to the House Speaker, Madigan, and for a time, both U.S. senators in Fitzgerald and Durbin.
And so it's understandable that the annual St. Patrick's Day parades, yes, plural, were becoming a staple of the local and state political circuit.
Well, happy St. Patrick's Day, live from downtown Chicago. Beautiful day. Let me tell you something. I don't think there's been a crowd of this size.
In 1993, a scene from the Academy Award-winning movie The Fugitive was covertly filmed during the St. Patrick's Day parade in downtown Chicago.
Dixon, man, look down there! Look down there! Jesus, he's in the plaza, Sam! He's heading east to the plaza!
Jerry Adams, the head of what's often called the IRA's political arm, Sinn Féin, even visited Chicago in the 1990s. For years, he was barred from entering the U.S. because the U.S. government said he was involved in terrorist activity. Despite opposition from British authorities, President Bill Clinton allowed him to obtain a visa.
Yeah, I saw him speak at Lane Tech High School to encourage support for the peace that would develop over the next few years. When he started speaking, nobody could understand him, and everybody was kind of looking at each other in the crowd and thinking it was just this thick Northern Irish accent. It turned out he was speaking Gaelic, and he let us all in on that and got a good laugh. So he was very disarming to the crowd and engaging. In fact, in the years since, he said that those visits to the U.S. in the 90s were actually an important part of the peace process.
Irish President Mary Robinson visited Chicago the following year. The Irish diaspora we talked about earlier had settled in around the world, and Chicago was a hub of Irish-American activity and pride. But as we mentioned in previous episodes, British authorities wanted the U.S. to crack down on what they said was a problem in the Irish-American community. Those Americans who were supporting the IRA.
This is what Ed Buckley had been assigned to investigate: the pipeline between Chicago and Ireland. This pipeline is what Joe O'Neill sent Dave to tap into. He wanted money, but he had also asked for Semtex, det cord, and detonators.
I'm Abden Palish,
I'm Bob Hergeth.
in partnership with Entropy Media.
This is Underbelly, the rebel kind.
Discord, fear, uncertainty would have been something that the FBI would have wanted to have generated.
They can get us weapons, they can get us money, they can get us political access, and we're going to use that as a tool in our armory.
The guy that they were getting the guns from was in the CIA.
The history of Ireland over the past millennium has been a history of oppression, of violence, of devastation, and importantly for our story, emigration. Millions of Irish Americans trace their roots to the people who fled the Great Hunger, the people who fled the Irish War of Independence, and more recently, those who fled the Troubles. In 1969, the British Army began patrolling the streets of Northern Ireland to stem the violence against Catholics by the Protestant majority. But the soldiers quickly turned on the Catholics, and the IRA's militant campaign is sparked anew.
From the early 1970s onwards, the IRA believed that the British public didn't give a shit about what was going on in Northern Ireland, and one of the ways to make them pay attention to it was to bring that war to Britain itself.
This is Professor Andy Wilson from Loyola University, Chicago, who you've heard from before. He's lived in Chicago for a long time and has a unique insight into the support of the Irish Republican cause among Irish Americans.
I think that the United States was important as a source of, certainly of a source of money. It wasn't, of course, the only source of money. It was part and parcel of their income, but it was also very important for publicity, the fact that the IRA had supporters in the most powerful country in the world. For those that were really leading a group like NORAD, and in Chicago as well, this would have been true, that it primarily would have been Irish-born people who would have come over to the city in the 1950s from various backgrounds, but many of them sort of disenchanted with the Irish government, that the economy was very bad there, some of them with Republican connections.
There were always Irish Americans who sympathized with the Republican cause. Many immigrants fled to America due to British oppression. But when the British government began cracking down on the IRA, particularly using internment without trial, the support from America galvanized. If you walked into Irish pubs across Chicago in the 1980s and 90s, there were buckets in the bar for donations to the cause. It wasn't always clear where that money went, but it was accepted by patrons as a part of the culture.
I think there would have been two main peaks, and one of the peaks of Irish American support for militant Irish nationalism in Ireland is the IRA would have been in the early 1970s. There were a whole series of issues that would have presented the Catholic community in Northern Ireland as being an embattled and besieged community.
Irish Republicans in America weren't going to turn their backs on their Republican comrades back in the old country.
A big one would have been the introduction of internment with pretrial in 1971. But of course, the really big one was Bloody Sunday in January 1972. After that, there would have been very significant sympathy for the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, and that certainly would have translated to a fair number of people who would also have been sympathetic to the IRA.
In response to the surge of violence, hundreds of suspected or alleged IRA members are locked up in Portlaoise Prison or Longkesh, a notorious British military site that was home to the infamous H-blocks, which we visited while researching this story. That's where Mickey McKevitt's wife's brother, Bobby Sands, died in hunger strike, seeking political status for IRA prisoners. Internment without trial and the hunger strikers are what captured international attention for the Irish Republican cause. It also fueled anger and boosted donations in the U.S., particularly to Irish Northern Aid, or NORAID. NORAID pledged money to go to the wives and children of those locked up for the Republican efforts.
In the 1970s, a lot of things began to change. The IRA began to take the war to Britain. They began to bomb British targets. A lot of people in the United States, many Irish Americans, were put off by that.
If you remember from the first episode, in my childhood, My family attended fundraising picnics to raise money for NORAID.
How the media was presenting Northern Ireland, and in particular the IRA, and in particular Irish Americans that were donating to NORAID. And you look at those editorials from the mid-1970s onwards, they really tear NORAID apart. There's absolutely no sympathy for anybody that's supporting the IRA.
As the troubles in Northern Ireland escalated, American politicians also took aim at NORAID.
I think that would have went hand in hand with the Irish government's efforts over here, but also, very importantly, people like Ted Kennedy and Daniel Moynihan and Hugh Kerry and others coming out. They made a major statement on St. Patrick's Day in 1977 in which they, advised Irish Americans not to donate funds that might be going to weapons, and they became strong advocates for the constitutional nationalist position since that time forward.
The shifting American political views of the Irish struggle change perceptions of that fundraising and lead to efforts to slow it down.
As far as the money is concerned, they were forced to register with the federal government under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So they did supply 6 monthly financial reports, but those reports may not have been entirely accurate.
The U.S. government makes an effort to hold American fundraising groups accountable for the money that's being sent to Ireland. But that's easier said than done.
It was very, very difficult, I believe, for the FBI to try and make a connection with money and the purchase of weapons, because it was pretty easy to get that money across to Ireland. You could leave O'Hare Airport with $10,000, and that was the ceiling of the money that you could bring over. You've got $10,000 in cash. Who's going to trace that? Apparently, there was a pretty steady flow of NORAID activists who were flying over Dublin from O'Hare and bringing money. Now, the whole question about, did that money go to buy weapons? That's certainly what the United States government alleged, and it's what the British government alleged, it's what the Irish government alleged.
Dave learned firsthand that the IRA could stretch a dollar, and if American fundraising groups are covering expenses for families, budgeting for everything else, like weapons, gets a little easier.
In some ways, it's a moot point, because there is the argument that even if all of that money did not directly go to buy weapons, it provided an important source of revenue that the IRA would have needed to have used anyway. The money that was going over, if it was all going for families of provosts that were in prison for welfare, that was money that then freed the IRA to buy weapons.
Nevertheless, authorities on both sides of the Atlantic are faced with the daunting task of stemming the flow of aid, which they say supports the IRA's armed efforts.
And I think that what he would have been leading in late 1980s into the 90s was an effort to try and tear the ass out of the IRA support network for what it was here in the city. Now, again, I can't verify this, but I think what set a lot of alarms off was the discovery in 1986 of a Barrett Light 50 that had been sent from Chicago to Dublin, and the implication that there was an arms network that was operating out of the city. The Brits were deeply alarmed at this. The Irish government were deeply alarmed at this, and they wanted it stopped.
In Chicago, FBI agents like Ed Buckley are actively digging into any suspected support networks.
If you're talking about, let's say, the FBI here in Chicago and dealing with the Republican community, discord, fear, uncertainty would have been something that the FBI would have wanted to have generated. Creating suspicions. Was somebody talking to the FBI? Is somebody giving information? There's a shitload of FBI documents that Ed Maloney was able to get from a colleague of mine, Nate Leafy, which shows the extent of FBI infiltration, use of informers. And it was pretty significant, even in Chicago, interviewing people. And even in the process of interviewing people, you're creating suspicion. And they would know that too. What are you saying? Why are they talking to you?
A fringe benefit of the FBI's investigations and use of informants to uncover illicit activity was creating distrust and infighting among the Republican groups, just like the British have been doing for decades in Ireland.
All of the mechanisms that the FBI would have at their disposal, mail interception, wiretapping, people who would go to NORAD meetings and give information about who was there, what was said, agents taking the license plates of cars that were there. These documents, show this all very clearly.
Despite the aggressive investigations, the U.S. government had a difficult time trying to stem the flow of money and alleged weapons.
Both the American and British governments had expended a lot of effort to disrupt the IRA since the Troubles began. The British government locked up suspected IRA members without trial and used extensive surveillance and counterintelligence, all to limited success. After all, that's why Dave Rupert still had a mission in the late 90s. It was no small task to shut off support for the Irish militants.
The authorities over here desperately wanted to stop that pipeline. And as I say, maybe every year, 2-3 big cases that the feds busted, and most of them, they were able to get convictions with. Maybe one of the most famous of the cases was the founder of NORAD, Michael Flannery, an old IRA veteran from the 1920s, and George Harrison, not of the Beatles, of course. George Harrison was maybe the most significant gun runner to the IRA, lived in Brooklyn, New York, I think.
Michael Flannery fought in the Irish War of Independence and later immigrated to the United States and started NORAD. Meanwhile, George Harrison, not the Beatle, as a 16-year-old, joined what was left of the Irish Republican Army and eventually made his way to the U.S. as a gun runner for the Provos.
And they were caught red-handed. They were busted. The feds had them on phone recordings. They had the weapons. And the argument that they used was that they thought that they were legit, that they weren't breaking any law, because they believed that the guy that they were getting the guns from was in the CIA. That was their argument. They said, we thought it was legit because the guy we were getting the guns from, a guy called George DeMille, that he had suggested he was in the CIA. So we said, if the CIA are involved, it has to be legit. They made that argument in court, and they ended up winning the case.
A group of pro-IRA Irish Americans, led by longtime Republicans Michael Flannery and George Harrison, won a court battle because they were able to argue the CIA was following every move they made, and if what they were doing was illegal or untoward, why would the U.S. government have let them get away with it?
George Harrison, in this court case, when the judge said, Mr. Harrison, some of the words of, we have records here that you have been shipping arms to the IRA since 1969. He stopped the judge and he said, I want to correct you, Your Honor, or whatever. I've been sending weapons to the IRA since 1940.
Irish-American attorney Frank Durkin is credited with the unorthodox argument that won that case. The CIA denied involvement, but jurors told reporters they were convinced the CIA had been involved. That was almost exactly 10 years before the failed attempt to prosecute Frank O'Neill for gun running. Ed Buckley's sting operation at the Irish Wolfhound failed to produce any convictions. In fact, Frank's lawyers laughed at the idea that he was involved in gun running. But almost another decade later, Dave Rupert is sent back to Chicago with a shopping list full of weapons and a name, Frank O'Neill.
You can pour help a white Frank. He was, I don't even, he believes in what he's doing. I just don't agree with her.
When Dave meets Frank O'Neill at his bar on the west side, Frank invites some of his heavies to check out Dave. Though Frank was initially suspicious of Dave, the reference from Joe O'Neill gave him solid street cred, and he passed inspection.
That's how I got in the Chicago group. Was Joe got me in the Chicago group. And Frank would refer to me and him as being old country. And I said, no, Frank, I'm not even Irish. Well, yeah, but you came from over there. I said, well, no, I didn't come from over there.
Frank takes a liking to Dave and calls him Old Country because he was referred to Frank from Ireland, even though he wasn't the least bit Irish. See, Dave's credibility flowed from Linda Vaughn to Joe O'Neill and now to Frank. It's a trail of introductions that gets him deeper into militant republicanism with each handoff.
Frank had a bitch because they hung his friend back in the 40s, and they shouldn't have, according to Frank.
Frank O'Neill is what you might call a true believer, a dyed-in-the-wool Republican.
First of all, his name was George Francis O'Neill. And he at one time was handed out for Royal prison that were handed out in Ireland. And he was in the Irish Army and wound up in the IRA and wound up doing a couple of jobs and got 28 years. And did 5, and he went to Canada and drove streetcars in Canada.
Frank O'Neill had done a fair amount of prison time before he was let out and fled to Canada and then to Chicago.
I think he got out of jail probably about 51 or so, 51. Because he had like 30 accidents in the first 6 months. He can't fucking drive. But he was always afraid because actually he was in Chicago legally because he hadn't, so to speak, disclosed the fact that he was an ex-prisoner.
But he went even further than most in his fight against the British.
Frank went to, I think the guy's name was Pittsburgh, but I'm not sure. It was the German ambassador to Ireland during World War II. And Frank will delegate her to get her out, meet with him or go to him and try to get the German to support the IRA to invade England.
Yes, Dave says Frank tried to get the Nazis to forge an alliance with the Irish during World War II to help the IRA take the fight to Britain at a very vulnerable time.
I might not be sure on the exact name of the details there pretty accurately because I got it from both Frank and Thorne, both sides. I was told the same story from both sides, so.
Frank wasn't alone. We've heard another story of a Nazi operative secretly parachuting into Ireland to liaise with the IRA, only to be later arrested. All of this was problematic for Ireland because the Republic was officially neutral during World War II. The country pledged to stay out of the conflict. And if you're going to stay out of a world war, you can't have IRA members carrying out attacks on English targets while England is fighting that war. This is the origin of what's known as the Offences Against the State Act. It was passed in Ireland in 1939, just as World War II began. The intention, according to an expert on the law, was to prevent rogue IRA groups from carrying out attacks and jeopardizing Ireland's neutrality. In order to keep the quote-unquote peace during the war, the Offences Against the State Act established the Special Criminal Court, one that did away with juries and allowed a judge to solely decide cases. It was also broadly worded and gave the Republic leeway to heavily prosecute people like Frank O'Neill, who were alleged to be actively pursuing support for the IRA's armed conflict and jeopardizing the Republic's neutrality during World War II.
I think it all started over some guy he knew, some friend of his who he knew, or some associate. They convicted him and hung him in Dublin. And Frank that he met for a fact what they accused him of doing that they hung him for. He was, and the other side of the country that round. Or, could have been Frank Cruz that he was from around that night. Maybe he was responsible for whatever he did.
But in its early days, the Offences Against the State Act is likely how Frank's friend ended up on death row. Though according to Dave, Frank said his friend was innocent. Beyond that, the choice of executioners added insult to injury.
And then they brought over I'm quoting Frank. They brought over a British hangman by the name of Bartholomew to hang him. To me, it wouldn't matter. You'd hang your hand, but they brought a British hangman to hang me, That's really a clap in the hand.
Frank was one of many IRA men over the years who faced harsh sentences and oppressive punishment, things that only served to radicalize them more. As the conflict with British occupiers became more desperate, so too did the IRA's tactics.
At that point in time, battle turned from fighting your enemy to somehow inflict damage on the non-combatants. It's easier to do, and somehow that pairs, and that's going to affect your enemy. And where that happened, that was really I go back to back in the days of old. The king was king because he was the meanest, baddest son of a bitch there was. He was at the head of every attack, or he was only king because he was the chosen one because he didn't have to get killed. At some point in time, he said, hey, wait a minute, if I stay at the back here, I'm going to live long, then you go to the front, and at that point in time, develop a politician, still a warrior, and Frank had an axe behind, they were so supposed to speak, Holland's plan, and the Brits were long for being there.
Frank was a storied Republican, the kind of IRA fighter who would garner deference from Irish Republicans who wanted to be part of the struggle. That's why he became a revered yet jovial leader of a group of wannabe rebels back here in Chicago.
The only one of the things that was funny is that I remember Frank telling me, well, some of us are going to wind up, but, this is going to come to time where some of us going to wind up going to jail, and I've done my time.
As Dave says, Frank had indeed done his time. Many of the Friends of Irish Freedom meetings were at Frank O'Neill's pub on the west side. The pub was no longer open, but Frank still kept the space and had liquor there. It was a place Frank had long entertained patrons with his dog Patch, who had been featured on Dave Letterman's Stupid Pet Tricks for his ability to push a cue ball with his paws. They'd set up fundraisers and public meetings at various Irish pubs around the city, like the Irish Wolfhound. 20 years ago, we went to one of those fundraisers and we talked to the whole group. They're all true believers there, and there was money to be raised. There was a raffle.
There was a guy playing the tin whistle. There was entertainment. There was a raffle of some sort. There may have been a cover charge, which we didn't pay, but that people were passing the hat there. And about 50 people, by my recollection.
Yeah, it was a full pub. It was a lively session. We had conversations before. We'd interviewed Frank, and this whole group, sort of downplayed Rupert's involvement with their group over the years.
And when we went there, we were both working at the Chicago Sun-Times as reporters at the time, and we told people up front we were doing some research on Dave Rupert, and I remember having some very enlivened, strange conversations with some of the people at the bar who were there for the event and there for the fundraiser.
But, when we talked to them about Dave Rupert, they would try to minimize his role there. And Frank would say, he maybe came in here and set up a couple of chairs one time, but they didn't really know him all that well, is what they said. They did know Dave very well. So by 1998, Dave had won over Frank and was going to meetings of this little group, which had changed names since the days of the Irish Wolfhound investigation. They were a ragtag handful of Irish and Irish-American Republicans who thought the more mainstream NORAID is too soft. This is the kind of group that authorities suspected may have been looking to fund weapons for the IRA. And they had a direct line to Republicans in Ireland. Dave describes a photo of the group with Republican Sinn Féin President Rory O'Brady.
There's more to that photo. There was actually the guy that had that photo. There was Richard and Deidre's face in there, Frank's face, and Roy O'Brady's face.
Republican Sinn Féin is an offshoot from the Provisional IRA's longtime political wing, Sinn Féin, and has long been linked to the Continuity IRA, A political division in 1986 prompted a walkout by what you could call less moderate Republicans who broke from Sinn Féin and created Republican Sinn Féin. Dave's new contacts back in Chicago had a direct line into so-called dissident Republican groups, and Dave was in.
Every good spy needs a cover story. When Dave is in Ireland hanging out with Joe O'Neill, he plays the wealthy American who supports the Irish Republican cause. One part of his cover was that he stole $750,000 from his company and spent it all on partying and women. But back in Chicago with Frank O'Neill, he plays it different. The FBI set him up with a phony trucking company office on Halsted Street. With little truck management to do, he started teaching himself how to create and manage websites. He was pretty handy with the newfangled internet that was all the rage back in the 90s. And he set up a little side business running websites. And this is how Dave got himself involved in a governor's race that could have put the U.S. government in an awkward position.
A young member in Frank O'Neill's group named Katrina got herself appointed campaign office manager for Congressman Glenn Pichard. He was a candidate for governor of Illinois in 1998. Dave said he had done a website for the Friends of Irish Freedom. So Katrina had a great idea. Why not have Dave do the website for Pichard's campaign?
I was the webmaster for Pichard, which got into a real sticky wicket, so to speak, because that was real touchy with it. But they were, could be construed as being involved in a gubernatorial election.
Dave asked the FBI if he could. He was trying to cultivate Katrina as an ally so it would look bad for him to refuse, he said. He told us he met Pichard at a fundraiser at Katrina's parents' house, and he seemed nice. While Dave was visiting Ireland, holed up in Joe O'Neill's real estate office, he worked on Pichard's website. The real problem came when Pichard said he wanted to list all his donors on the website. Dave, an unpaid volunteer, spent countless hours in Joe O'Neill's office in Ireland and at his phony truck office on Halsted, entering all those names. Pichard was a Baptist who opposed abortion, gay marriage, and gun control, but he was a pro-union Democrat. Pichard's views made him a tough sell in Chicago, but Katrina was 100% on board. But Dave said the problem was the campaign's computers could not save anything. He said he could try reformatting the whole system, and the campaign gave him the go-ahead to try. The website crashed. Boatloads of donor records were lost. A lot of egg covered a lot of faces. The campaign says it was Dave's fault. Dave and Katrina had to leave the campaign. Pichard went on to win the Democratic primary, but he lost the general election to one of those aforementioned Irish-American politicians. Even when Dave was outed as a mole a few years later, nobody in Illinois politics connected the dots. Pichard said he had no idea his website was composed in Ireland by an FBI spy. Dave's cover stories deflected suspicion because he always did the work. He scrubbed vomit off the floors at the Drow's Inn, handled rowdy drinkers as a bouncer at Joe O'Neill's pub, and sat in a back office programming websites. As Dave once said, who the fuck would think what were they really up to? And Dave was hardly the only American getting involved in the Republican cause.
Irish Republicans are used to the braggadocio Americans coming over and shooting their mouths off. For the provisionals, it would be NORAID, the Northern Irish Aid Committee. They would always come over to Belfast, shoot their mouths off.
This is Sean Pogachnik, who you've heard from in previous episodes. He's an American journalist who's lived in Dublin and Belfast for the past 25 years.
Usually in August, and the anniversary month for internment of Irish suspects without trial in 1971. August was also the deployment of British troops for the first time in August 1969. So August was always this time when the Americans who supported the IRA would come over and kind of, have their terrorism holiday. And if there were events, they would speak at them.
Dave isn't like most Americans who travel to Ireland to support the Republican cause. He never tried to play soldier or hero.
And of course, on one hand, And this is why David Rupert was so successful infiltrating this group. On the one hand, Irish Republicans of any stripe loved having the Americans over because it helped them punch above their weight. They wanted to deploy Irish America against the Brits and against the Protestants, the Unionists. So they loved having them, but they're also deeply patronizing toward them. They assumed these people were quite clueless about the modern realities of Ireland. These people kind of had a notion of Ireland that was stuck somewhere between the potato famine and the Irish Civil War. And, if you talk to, provisional activists who had to deal with Irish America, they'd say, well, like, they're useful, but actually we don't really have a lot in common with these people.
What Sean is getting at when he speaks of the patronizing attitude towards Americans is the simple fact that they are far removed from the conflict.
They're extremely right-wing, where some of us are Marxist. But, they can get us weapons, they can get us money, they can get us political access, and we're going to use that as a tool in our armory. And so if David Rupert showed up at one of these, I'm sure, tiny, not attended by the media meetings, and he gave a speech, that's what they would expect him to do.
The people of Ireland, particularly those in the north, have lived a life surrounded by a guerrilla conflict, the likes of which has never been the reality in the United States.
There were Americans who, of course, disconnected from modern realities of Ireland. It's very easy when you're in Boston or San Francisco to say the struggle must continue, because it doesn't affect you. It's just something that you can romanticize from 3,000 to 6,000 miles away. And those people become very useful sources for support and force multipliers who are willing to support a dead-end cause from thousands of miles away. So, of course, a Mickey McKevitt would desperately want, if he could have gotten the support from Moscow, he'd have taken that too. But the fact is, he had this American who was a smuggling background, brought money, sounds good.
Dave's background and behavior made him stand out among other Americans who supported the cause. He was measured and calculated. He listened and then engaged carefully. That's probably one of the reasons he was so readily accepted into the various groups. He wasn't what Sean Pagachnik says they would have been expecting. He was a breath of fresh air, and he was a pocket full of cash, because he had volunteered himself as the bagman carrying envelopes of cash raised in Chicago to distribute in Ireland. Frank O'Neill's group would sell raffle tickets, charge door fees, or even auction things off. Dave says the cash would be handed to him, and he would take it straight to Ireland. Dave said very little of that money would ever make it to the families of the IRA prisoners it was pledged to.
Nobody relates to the $100 they use to buy the ticket here. It's really, a direct line, to buy stuff there. Oh, no, it's for the puzzle. Well, I want to tell you what, you'd be a hard time eating here on what the prisoners get. Whatever money does go over there.
Always the thinker, Dave, of course, had a solution.
What they need to do is go through or two from the organizations over to people, individual people in the organizations over here who had knowingly supplied money to them, Because let me tell you something. If anybody thinks that if I donate $100, that I'm going to wind up tied to a lawsuit to terrorism, it's like, well, never mind, I don't want to donate that time.
Dave theorizes that dragging organizations like NORAID into court and connecting the donations to violence would make people think twice about contributing. But he maintained the U.S. was never as big a source of money as it always seemed.
As much violence as nothing, because the newspapers were talking about violence money is coming from Russell. No, it's always been exaggerated. Yeah. But I mean, not exaggerated, I guess was, would be a mild word for it,
Dave estimates he brought over a total of about $30,000 from American IRA support groups. We should note that there is lots of money Irish Americans donate every year through nonprofits with good ratings from charity watchdogs. But that's not who Dave is dealing with. What concerns the FBI and MI5 are the dollars raised by the groups Dave is infiltrating and whether they are going for IRA weapons and operations. Dave is the big yank who's put in his dues at the pubs, listening to the songs, learning the politics. He's been taken in by the continuity IRA and welcomed into the fold. And there's one constant he's noticed after spending years with the IRA and the Republican movement.
would fight more between the groups. I mean, in the within the groups, fighting each other within the groups, or spirits and stuff. We were fighting with having that for the certain remnant. Yeah, I mean, they wanted a whole lot more of their own people than were total to Brit. Yeah.
Whether it's fundraising groups in Chicago or IRA veterans in Bundoran, there was always infighting and fractures.
In 1998, there's even more cause for Republican infighting as a peace deal, which would come to be known as the Good Friday Agreement, was being negotiated. These talks, facilitated by the Clinton administration, were looking to bring an end to the Troubles once and for all.
The Republicans would always argue none of them ever provided a settlement because they all failed to address the fundamental cause of the conflict in Ireland, and that was the continued British presence in the 6 counties and the imposition of partition.
This is former Republican Sinn Féin President Des Dalton.
Those issues were addressed. Republicans would argue that a real settlement, a real lasting and just and peaceful settlement was possible.
After decades of violence, peace was finally in reach for the people of Northern Ireland. But to some Republicans, settling for peace without a united Ireland was a non-starter. It was another compromise in a long list of compromises that simply wouldn't stand. That's next time on The Rebel Kind.
If you liked this episode of The Rebel Kind, you could do us a favor by leaving a positive review on whatever hosting service you're listening to us on.
The Rebel Kind is created and hosted by Bob Hergeth and Abden Palish. Executive producer, Anjay Nagpal. Written by Dalton Main, Abden Palish, and Bob Hergeth. Senior producer, Dalton Main.
Editing and sound design by Catherine Anderson. Original music by Dale Eisinger. Special thanks to the Drovers for additional music. Special thanks to Loyola Chicago's Andy Wilson for lending us his vast knowledge of the Troubles and connections here in America. Mixing by Gerard Bauer. Show art by Rebecca Hendon.
Our show was recorded in the podcast studio at Roosevelt University. Our development producers were Danielle Elliott and Jen Swan.
Marketing support from Tessa Cairns Clay. Production legal by Bruns, Brennan, and Barry. Legal clearance fair use by Rachel Strom at Davis Wright Tremaine.
From Entropy Media, the Underbelly series was created by Anjay Nagpal. Executive producer, Josh Fielstad. Executive producer, Gerard Bauer. Head of operations is Nuna Ebo. Project manager is Sebastian Perry. Associate producer, Heidi Rudvoets. Development and production support, Simona Kessler.
Special thanks to Flynn McRoberts for calling us in 20 years ago. This series is dedicated to the innocent victims of Northern Ireland's decades of violence.